At that. All right. Well, we're recording. It's top of the hour, and as I mentioned, we'll see a few folks come in as we keep going, and most of the folks will catch the video later on. And there's, just so you're aware, Cable, I'm in a hotel room. I've got my evening maid service. They come knocking somewhere along the line, so if that happens, I'll have to briefly mute and step away. But anyway, so just by way of a quick introduction for those of you that are going to catch this recording later. So Cable Green is someone who I met, it's got to be about a decade plus. I think it was actually somewhere in Ohio when I first came across Cable's work. And then he ended up going out to Washington, as in the state. And while I was in Washington, he was doing some fascinating work around promoting openness and trying to get broader adoption of openness, and some fascinating work around open textbook initiatives, and the list goes on. So one of the things I've been most fascinated by with Cable and his career and his work has been the heavy focus on really staying very focused and true, if you will, to the different aspects of openness and how that impacts education and increases opportunity. So maybe, if you don't mind, if you could start by just giving us a little bit of an overview, Cable, of your background and how did you get to where you are now, and what drew you to openness in the education field?
Yeah, sure. So, George, you're right. We met a long time ago. I think you were one of the keynotes at the Ohio Learning Network conference. That was, gosh, that could have been 20 years ago. How did I get here? The short story, and happy to talk in detail if it's interesting. My doctorate was in education psychology, and that's when I started reading you. And I got really interested in connectivism and how people learn, and particularly how they're learning, or how they started learning when the internet became a thing. And that happened right when I was at Ohio State doing my studies. And so my job happened to be building online courses for the allied health groups at Ohio State. I worked in the College of Pharmacy. So I got really interested in how people learn with technology. The internet fascinated me, and my doctoral dissertation was about how people learn in the public. I didn't know anything about open yet. Nobody told me about open licensing. I just had this experiment where people were sharing as they were learning out on public web servers, because we had this new crazy thing called the internet. I then, as you said, went to Washington State. I started working with community and technical colleges. I'd always worked with, at the state level, I'd always worked with universities before. And frankly, I was just kind of shocked and unpleasantly so at the lack of finances and just financial buffers that these community college students had. These were hardworking people who were trying to, have a better life, get a better job, get that next degree, make more money, or just overall improve their own education status. And over, I kept hearing stories about how that little bit of money, that alternator I need to fix on my car is enough to not let me buy that textbook or not let me afford that next class. And so I was really struck with the lack of access that so many people, at least in my state, had to a higher education. And right about that time, I learned about open educational resources. I learned about Creative Commons. Somebody told me about what MIT was doing and other universities where they were freely sharing educational content. And then I stumbled across people like Stephen Downs and Rory, and who your students have talked to, David Wiley and others, who really had grabbed a hold of this idea that when things are digital, you can store, distribute, and make copies of them for near zero cost. And because we can do that as educators, we probably have an obligation to do that as educators, because education's all about sharing knowledge, about sharing ideas, about distributing information, scientific works, et cetera, as widely as we possibly can. That's part of the calling of the academy. So all this stuff kind of came together when I was working at the community colleges, and we launched some OER projects eventually that led me to leading education at Creative Commons. So I've talked long enough. I'll stop there. If you want to dive deep in any of those areas, happy to do so.
Sure. No. Why don't we start, before we go into more detail broadly, why don't you start by just Creative Commons? What does it do, and what is your role?
So my role at Creative Commons, I'm the lead in education. So my title is Director of Open Education. Creative Commons is a global nonprofit organization. We are 15 years old, coming up on 16 years old. And Creative Commons is, the reason for its existence is it sits between all rights reserved copyright and works going into the public domain. So if you build a creative work pretty much anywhere in the world, it's automatically copyrighted. It's protected by the law. And copyright law says that only the creator, only the author has the legal rights to make copies, perform the work, modify the work, translate the work into a different language, etc. And if you think about educational resources or scientific resources or government data, all these are things that when they're digital, they're really easy to modify. And with the internet, it's really easy to share them online. And so before Creative Commons, if you wanted to share a copyrighted work, you really had to have access to an attorney to write a license for somebody to do something with your work. So if you think about like Harry Potter books, J.K. Rowling is the author, she's the copyright holder to those works, and she and her lawyers give a license to Warner Brothers when they want to make a movie. Well, most of the public doesn't have their own personal attorneys, can't afford that, and so sharing was really difficult. Even though the internet made sharing easy technically, legally it was tough. So the whole point of Creative Commons is to reduce the friction of sharing and make it simple and legal to keep your copyright on your work and then share it under the terms and conditions that you choose. That's what we do.
And you were just talking earlier, you do an awful lot of traveling. You're focused on really trying to spread the gospel, if you will. What does that look like on a given day for you?
Yeah, so it varies. I always tell people about half of what I do in a day, I don't know what it's going to be until it runs across my desk. So for example, just the other day, somebody dropped on my desk a new strategy from textbook publishers in the United States to wrap up the cost of textbooks and other curricular materials into tuition, so that students would pay that on the front end and that faculty would essentially lose choice of what educational resources they're using in their classes. It's not something I planned for, but that's a good example of where we have to step up and in this case create a national awareness campaign, let everybody know this is happening and what they can do about it. You mentioned travel. My time's split kind of 50-50. About half of my time I do teach people about open education, not just open educational resources, which is all the stuff, but open education is broader. It's about open pedagogy or open practices or praxis, as the Europeans call it. And the idea there is when you're dealing with open content, you can, and George was one of the pioneers of this, you can start to think about interactions with students in new ways. And students can start to co-create knowledge. They can help design the course. They can update the content, make it better. One of the ideas I'm playing with right now with the United Nations is the UN just came out with its updated Sustainable Development Goals. They used to be called the Millennial Development Goals. Now they're the Sustainable Development Goals, but these essentially are the grand challenges of the day. So it's things like poverty and clean water and climate change and gender equity, and education is number 4 of the 17 goals. And so we're having conversations about using open educational resources not only to educate people around the world about these 17 sustainable development goals, but even more important in my thinking, how do we make education about solving those goals? So don't just put me in a class about physics, put me in a class where I'm learning physics, but I'm actually solving climate change as I'm doing it. So about half of my work is teaching people about, yes, licensing and how to share content and how to find OER and how to engage in these new practices. The other half of my time is around policy work. So a lot of what we do is we work with governments, foundations, really anybody with money and resources, and we try to get them to require open licensing on the products or either the content or the software that they're funding. So for example, we worked with the US Department of Labor. Labor now requires a Creative Commons attribution license on everything that Labor funds in its discretionary grants. Department of Education has a rule under consideration right now to do the same thing. USAID's whole education program requires a CC BY license on what they fund. Gates is doing this now on their research. So the idea is if you take our money to build something, and in the case of governments, if you're taking this public money to build something, then what you build should be freely and openly available to the public.
Yeah, and that's something, particularly the idea of advocacy in this course, we haven't really gotten into the need for any type of right or freedom, if you will, requires maintenance and some level of continued focus to make sure that by bits and pieces it's not eroded. And I recall, this sounds like at least it's a growing role in the kind of work that you're doing. Is a few years ago where there was you were, I think, involved in leading a charge against some initiative that textbook publishers had to get something similar like this, I imagine, but where there was an attempt to prevent the creation of open education resources if there was already a proprietary piece of information available, and so. How much of the kind of activity that Creative Commons does now is at that maintenance of freedoms already granted, sort of preventing, being vigilant, much like the electronic, EFF and other groups like this are? Is that a big part of the activity you're engaged in now?
Yeah, it oftentimes is. Sometimes we're on the defense. Sometimes we're holding the line. Sometimes we're on the offense. So you're right. The example you gave was right when it wasn't even, Labor hadn't even required a CC BY license on all of its grants yet. They just had one grant. And the grant was big. It was $2 billion to U.S. community colleges. But the American Association of Publishers saw that as a threat, and they saw it as a policy slippery slope. And so they snuck into the omnibus budget bill in the House. So they actually got to members of Congress, and they put in a clause which essentially said, what you said, George, that you cannot take a federal grant to build something if it's available on the commercial market. Now that was stopped by Senator Dick Durbin. The Senate essentially told the House, no, that's not going to fly when it gets to conference committee, so don't even propose it, and it died on the spot. But had we not seen that and been alerted to that, it could have very easily snuck through because the omnibus budget bill was, yay thick. And so, yes, we have to be constantly vigilant about legislation. So the one I just mentioned is actually proposed legislation about wrapping the cost of textbooks into tuition and fees, so that faculty would lose academic freedom around choosing books. Students, really wouldn't have a chance to opt out. OER would be, dead on arrival because there'd be no need. That's very likely going to be legislation in all 50 states in the next legislative session starting in January, February. So unfortunately, that's going to suck a lot of our time, and not just our time, but other open organizations across the country. Another area that we work in a lot is copyright reform. So in Europe right now, there are some really nasty proposals around expanding and extending the reach of copyright. So for example, one of the craziest ones is a proposal to not allow you to link to a site if your intentions are commercial. I mean, there's just some crazy stuff. The Europeans threatened the right of panorama, which is the right for George Siemens to walk down through downtown Rome with his camera and take pictures of the Colosseum. They were threatening to take those rights away unless you had permissions from the people who owned the Colosseum. So things like that, we and others get involved to make sure that those rights are retained for the public.
Yeah, and that's, again, it's something that we, as I mentioned, we haven't really looked at that much. And who advocates for preservations of rights attained? There's always pressure in certainly the publisher area to find ways to improve control of that marketplace, and whether that's workarounds in the form of having opportunities for the book to be included in tuition, or whether it is just legislative approaches such as requiring that commercial content be explored first for federal grants. It's fascinating how I mean, and it makes sense, really. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and there's a lot of people who have a lot of money to make in this. But one of the things I found a bit disconcerting, and so I'll throw a hypothesis out, and you and I have talked about this before, so you're familiar with this argument, and I know you've heard it in other venues too, but that publishers have largely acquiesced on open content, and they've now started to build their economic value points on peripheral elements such as the use of analytics and the use of interactive learning activities and so on, so that the content might be free, but it's tied and integrated to a range of other services so that you're no longer just dealing with content. You're having to buy that entire experience or that entire equation, if you will. What are you at Creative Commons seeing from that end, and how are you looking at changing or at least responding to some of those changes? Like, it's basically the point of conflict has shifted away from content. They've sort of acquiesced that, given up that in order to prevent, to preserve a bigger kingdom.
Yeah, I think you're right. And if you look at the acquisitions, the business acquisitions that Pearson and others have been making, Cengage included, they're buying analytics companies in many cases. They're buying data companies. And as you said, they're moving away from content. They're still fighting what we call a rear guard action, right? They still fight for content because it's still in higher ed. It's roughly a $9 billion a year industry. And in K-12, it hovers between $6 and $9 billion a year. So there's still a lot of money in content, and they'll fight as long as they have money to make there. But you're right, they're going up market, and up market means these new platforms which allow for personalized learning pathways, which have all the analytics, which provide the dashboards to the students and the teachers. I agree with you. I would say, and I've been arguing for a couple of years, that if the open education movement does not compete with the publishers and other providers with either affordable or maybe even open source tools along with the open educational resources, it's an apples and oranges argument, and we've lost, because the cost of doing business will have changed, where you've got to have the technology platform to go with the content. And the publishers are already speaking this way. Pearson for years stopped calling itself a textbook company, and now they call themselves a learning company. And what they talk about when you listen to their senior execs is all about data. It's all about student success tied to data and analytics. And so I think what I mentioned that I spend half my time in the policy space. We're not just talking with policymakers about having open license requirements on content that they fund, but we're talking with folks like the National Science Foundation and saying, look, as you're funding initiatives, think about this shift that's happening in education. And NSF, for example, is fully capable of putting out, a multi or tens of millions of dollars grants over a period of time to fund activities like this. And there's no reason why we can't provide these tools, build these tools through consortiums like Solar and others to make these available to the public and let people use them at their educational institutions without being locked into a particular vendor. And the other thing, and I think, George, you've wrote about this, that's I think very concerning to us at Creative Commons, is part of the value system that we advocate for is openness of content through licensing and openness of software, but also openness in the spirit of transparency. And one of the challenges of these commercial analytics platforms is that their algorithms are dark, and you simply can't see in. And it's if we're going to start to shift in education to data-driven outcomes and recommendation systems for what students see and when they see it and how they're interacting in their educational experience, it only makes sense that in the same way that scientific inquiry must be open and published, and we have to be able to see people's methods, we need to be able to see the algorithms that are driving these systems as well. And if we can't see that, in my mind, that's an important enough reason to have open alternatives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I'm worried about is the power of a system comes from its points of integration. And so when a publisher is able to go to a university or to a faculty member and they're able to provide the content, which the faculty member can get it for free online through an OER. But then they add layers. They add the integration to the university's learning management system. They add a range of teaching resources and materials so the faculty member doesn't have to pull together their own PowerPoint slides. Then they'll add some level of assessment to for students to be able to go online and take tests and so on, and quizzing, so students will have to pay for a key. To do that, the university or the faculty members will agree to it because they're not the ones paying, and the list goes on. And so when all of these things come together, you've got the content, you've got the integration with the platform, you've got the testing and the assessment and the evaluation that goes along with it, you've got the teaching materials that support the content. Then you add in the algorithms that do prediction on student performance. You add in, especially as we move more to personalized and adaptive learning, it's not prominent yet, but it's very close to becoming prominent because of the number of vendors and the number of dollars that are flowing into this space. So once we get to that stage, then all of a sudden, what is OER going to do? And I think the key criteria for open education movement to do in order to address this is we have to start making our competency frameworks open. We have to start advocating for having the algorithms that underpin things like student sorting and assessment, predictive models, early warning systems, and so on. Those need to be open. Universities shouldn't buy closed software systems. Faculty shouldn't buy into an entire system of instruction, and the list goes on. So I think those are, for me, some of the key challenges that exist, and I don't think most proponents in the open education space are paying enough attention to this yet. But what are you seeing from your end? You travel a lot. You travel globally. Are people waking up to the reality of that's where the fight has shifted to, or are we not quite there yet as a movement?
I think, so let me share a link here for your students to look at later. There was a discussion, and it's at oerstrategy.org, and the discussion was, what are we as a movement doing well, and what are we not doing well, and what's it going to take to mainstream open education? And so it's kind of this self-critical analysis of what the next steps might be. So a lot of what you just said is in this doc, and there's some kind of a pathway of how we get from where we need to be. It's not quite as sharp as you just laid it out. It could be better. I would say that probably 10% of the people that are going to the big OER conferences are having this conversation, which is good. I think the challenge for many people working in open education is it's still a relatively young field, right? It's only 10 years old, 12 years old. And so it's, so for example, I was in Virginia last week, and, David Wiley stood up and said, how many people are new to the conference? Like half the hands went up. So, Babson just did their survey, Jeff Siemens' work, and it came out 75% of the faculty in the United States still don't know what OER is. So there's still this newness to it. And when people engage it for the first time, they come to it mostly for cost reasons. I want to save my students' textbooks money. So they're like embedded in this basic content idea. They're not thinking about the overall structure or system. The other challenge is even people that understand everything that you just said, they're engaging in their advocacy work or their education work or their policy work in very niche, narrow ways. And they have to, in many cases, bend their arguments toward the audience they're dealing with. So if if we're working with policymakers, so I was talking with the U.S. Department of State last week. State cares about efficiency. They care about, the ROI for the public money they're putting out. They care about the diplomatic effects that their grants are having. They don't really care about learning analytics, right? So that compilation argument, although they might be interested in it, it's not going to be what convinces them. And I think too often, those of us that are advocates and are out on the road, we get sucked down these holes as we're trying to quote unquote make the sale of the open policy or the big open textbook adoption or whatever it might be. And any particular audience doesn't care about the whole system. They care about the one part of the system that bothers them. And so I think that's an overall challenge for the movement. I also think that a lot of folks, and I know this is true of me when I was faculty. This is I don't know. You probably can pull out the philosopher of who talked about this better than most. But when you're in the system, when you're the fish in the fishbowl, you don't see the water anymore. And when you're faculty at UT Austin and you've got the learning management system and the analytics system, and your dean's telling you that now you have to report on this data, and here's the new system on how you're going to do that. To try to disaggregate and deconstruct that system in a way where you want to be critical of it, you want to push transparency into it, and you might want to pull one puzzle piece out so that you've got authority to put another one in. That's all work, and it may be time that you don't have, and you're trying to get promotion and tenure. And so I struggle a little bit with where do we have this conversation where it's, because you're right, it's important if we don't have this conversation, and if we don't put forth our arguments from the open side of things in a way that's convincing to enough people, it's difficult to generate a movement of change. And we can have these. You and I can have these conversations. We have these conversations sometimes at summits. Certainly, we will at the Creative Commons Summit in Toronto. You should come, George. Let's talk about this. We'll have a session on it. But maybe you have some ideas about how we can generate a movement around that in education, because I think that's what we're missing.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason is the changing landscape, I believe, with a lot of people because in order to make things happen, you really have to get down to details. We had a wonderful period, which you were aware, in late 90s, early 2000, there was Stephen Downs, David Wiley, myself. This was a bit pre-Creative Commons work going on. There was a lot of activity getting started. We were talking about openness. And then MIT came along with OpenCourseWare in 2003. And at that time, Stephen and I had been working on an initiative called Open Education, and we had a group coming together to try and get this going. We brought David Wiley in to start looking at the content licensing and so on. OCW blew things up, and so there was this very heady period where we were all out there busy doing things that just, we were committed to the cause, so to speak. But then once we started getting some of those activities happening, we started getting a conversation going on with university leaders and provincial and state officials. We're starting to listen. Ministers were paying attention to it. Then all of a sudden, the really important work started, which was the mucky work of getting OERs on the radar of a faculty senate or on a college vice president academics agenda. Addressing the issues of licensing schemes, the details of how one license plays with another license, and that started to become important conversations, and the list goes on. What happens, though, and this is not uncommon in any kind of broad movement or change, is the visionary work that happens, which is fun and exciting to a group of people, starts coming down to impact and practice, fighting for policy, handling workshops to let people know how OERs work and how to bring them in, and the list goes on. That's the practical work. But in the midst of that, it's so overwhelming with the amount of things going on and the policy and so on that you sometimes lose that overview that happens when you're trying to define a movement. And I think we've lost some of that overview, that broad visioning of how is the landscape changing, because we've been so deep in our successes around content and OERs and seeing it deployed, and we're keeping busy, that we haven't seen, or many of us haven't recognized, that the publishers have started to play a different game. We're playing checkers, they're playing chess. They have an entirely different vision for what's happening. And so I think that's my concern, is that the academics and the researchers and the people in this space aren't seeing, or if they are, they're just too busy to respond to it, but how there is a new reality being woven in the background by publishers as a way of future revenue generation through selling an integrated system rather than selling a textbook. And that, I think, is the biggest threat that I see to openness in education going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a panel last week at the Open Ed conference, and I'm sitting next to Martin Weller from the UK, and there's a whole bunch of people up there. And MIT OCW is sitting there. David Wiley's in the audience, and he asked this question. And he says, look, the publishers are moving in these directions. What do we do? And my response was, look, we have to match them. We have to match them move for move and surpass them if possible. And we've got to do so with 1/100th or 1/1000th of the resources that they have and no sales force. And we're going to figure out how to do that in a grassroots kind of way with policy support and money where we can get it. But if we don't match them, if we can't go to faculty and say, look, here's what Pearson's offering you, and here's the open alternative. So, for example, today Pearson sells a lot of Pearson My Math Lab. There is My Open Math. My Open Math is not nearly as pretty. There's not nearly the amount of resources to go in, but it's getting big adoption because faculty buy into the transparency. It's freely available. It's open source software. It fits nicely with the OER. And so that's an example where even where we've got, I would argue, an inferior product, no offense to the My Open Math folks, they're doing great work, but they don't have Pearson pockets. They've got huge adoptions and continue to take market away from that. So I don't think we have to be even as good as, but we have to be able to compete. And not just compete function for function and feature for feature, but we have to be there, right? We have to be at the moment that faculty are making decisions or that departments or institutions are making decisions. You actually have to be in that meeting. You have to be in that sales moment, if you will. And if we're not, we're simply not part of the game. So anyway, I gave an answer like that. And I said, look, it's going to require renewed investment. Here's all the ways we could do that. Some other folks from the UK, especially, you got to love the Europeans, right? So although they had Brexit, so maybe they're not European anymore. We'll see. Maybe we're having United States exit right now too. We'll see how that goes. So anyway, they came forward and said, maybe we don't. Maybe open is a totally different deal. Maybe this push toward the corporatization, the data-drivenness of education is one way of going about it. But what if our way was different? So what if we're not just openly licensing the content, we have open source software, but what if we're really selling a different vision of education, right? So you said we're playing checkers, they're playing chess. What if we start to play Go? So what are the other alternatives? And should we, base education purely around a connectivist open pedagogy framework that doesn't require open analytics? And so they were sort of pushing this alternative argument. I don't know what the answer is, but we need to have more conversations like that.
No, absolutely. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to just jot them in here or request the mic. Otherwise, we'll sort of start moving toward a bit of a wrap up here shortly. You mentioned that you were at the Open Ed conference this last week. What did you learn while you were there? What's new in the openness field?
Well, one thing I always learn is the different techniques and tactics that people in the trenches are using to move institutions, to move policies to open. And so that's always encouraging me because I learn things I didn't know, and we all can help each other. What did I learn that was big there? The publishers showed up in droves. It was very interesting. Some senior people from Cengage, American Association of Publishers. That was a good indication to me that we are at a new level of maturity as a field where we're enough of a threat that they're going to invest time of their senior folks to come check out and see what's going on. It's the old Gandhi phrase, right? First they laugh at, or first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight, then you win. We're definitely in the they're ready to fight stage. Other than that, it was a bit of a family reunion like it always is, and that's okay too. There's a lot going on right now globally. We talked a little bit about some of the travel that's coming up. I'm going to Malta soon. The European Union is having a big conference for the entire EU about what you said, right? How are digital technologies and data affecting education, and what should we be doing, and how might it connect to the Bologna process is kind of the theme of it. And plus open education. So they're going. What's interesting in the EC is that the presidents and the prime ministers of the European Union take turns leading what's called the European Council, and the Maltese president is going to take a turn for the first 6 months of 2017. So there are these consistent moments, or not consistent. There are these opportunities that keep popping up where we are getting to sit down with leaders, political leaders. So that's an opportunity where I'm going to sit down and ask for a fix to the No disrespect to the EC, but they have a very sloppy open licensing policy for their Erasmus grants, for all their education grants, that says if you take their money, any of their billions of euros that they're giving out, you have to put an open license on what you build, but that's all it says. Their compliance rate is near zero, and so that's not working well. So we're going to try to get that fixed. Another example, I'm going to Malaysia in a couple weeks right after U.S. Thanksgiving, because the Commonwealth is pulling together all of its education leaders from around the country in Kuala Lumpur, or from around the world, and we're going to be sitting down for about half day and talking with those countries and institutions, universities mostly, about how they can support open education and require, when they provide funding, that it have a Creative Commons license on what they fund. And so the arguments that you see in that OER strategy document that I shared, they're working and they're persuasive. And so, yes, existing business models, give us a hard time. Yes, they outgun us on people, staffing, and resources, and their budgets are infinitely larger than ours. But when we're in the room and when we've got a fair shot at an argument, we tend to win those arguments. And to me, that's encouraging, because it's always nice to know that your comms are good enough, that your arguments are sound. But it's also encouraging, to me anyway, that policymakers and chancellors and individual faculty members are persuaded by arguments of openness and transparency and access and equity. And these are things that tend to carry the day when we're in the room. And even when we get outgunned out of the room. So recently, Governor Brown in California proposed in the budget $5 million for what he called Z degrees, which are zero textbook cost degrees. So essentially you take a whole degree program and you make all of it OER, textbooks included. We were in there with the governor's staff, helping to flesh out what this might look like. The publishers held what they called a breakfast meeting with the California Assembly, which is the legislature there. And the breakfast meeting was closed door. Campaign checks get handed out at this breakfast meeting. Of course, they have nothing to do with the topics at hand, but we just really like what you're doing and we want to support your campaign. Of course, we're not able to hand out $5,000 and $10,000 checks from the open movement, and we don't. And if we did have the money, we wouldn't do it anyway, because we believe that's crooked politics. But they did that. And there's nothing we can do about those breakfast meetings. And at the end of the day, the governor still was able to pass the $5 million for Z degrees. Now, the publishers continue to try to throw sand in the wheels of that, but the fact is it's going forward. They tried to kill the California Community College Chancellor's Office, put forward a proposal and passed it, that all of the money that flows through their coffers carries a CC BY license. And if you don't like those terms, don't take the money. Publishers tried to kill that. The chancellor said, no, this is the right thing. We're dealing with public money. We're going to make sure that it's open, and that, our old model is that we funded one community college in California to do something. Now we're going to fund one community college to do something, and all of the California community colleges and anybody else in the world can take it and use it as well. It's just a better use of public money. And so our arguments in the open community are, I'm glad to say, difficult to argue against. And so when we get a fair hearing, or even when we don't get a fair hearing, we tend to win. But we've got to be in those places, and that's one of our biggest challenges right now. So, for example, WIPO, we can't be in all the WIPO meetings. It's laborious. It's in Brussels. We don't have somebody in Brussels. And the meetings are boring as hell and nobody wants to go to them. But that fifth meeting that you weren't at, they're going to wipe out fair use and fair dealing rights for libraries and education. If you're not there, you'll lose. And so, that's the constant challenge for our movement, is to be in those places and arm people with the right arguments.
Thank you, and I think that's on that note, I think that's a terrific point to sort of move toward conclusion on, because the early stages of success with openness in education was largely ignored, as you use the Gandhi quote. But now that it has made an impact and a dent economically to publishers and related organizations, the reality is that the opposition is relentless. And exactly like you said, if you miss that one meeting, that one discussion, that one backroom deal that was arranged, a lot of damage can be done in a short process. So, Cable, I just want to say a quick thanks again. It's always a pleasure. I know you've been in these courses. I think this is probably your third time that you've met to meet with a group. And I think one of the things that excites me from particularly the individuals that are engaged in this course is many of them are educators. There are people making decisions about OERs. They're working in institutions that maybe aren't quite aware of it, but now they're starting to pay more attention to it. And so these kinds of discussions really have a ripple effect that sometimes take a long cycle to make that real impact known. And I'm reminded on that topic, when you and I first connected out in Ohio in the meeting, out of the folks that were there, and I remember after I did my keynote, we sort of ushered in a group of us in a small room, and there was about, I think, 25 people there. Some of them were folks who were leading the conference and so on. But are those individuals, I think you're the only one that I recall still interacting with. But thinking about those long-term ripple impacts of discussions of openness, you just don't know where the trace will end up. But because it's such important work and it's work that has such a big impact, you know that if the right people engage in the ideas and hear about it, that it will have an impact. And I think that's what excites me. And it excites me that there's folks like you and David and others that are sort of on the forefront of keeping that conversation going. So huge privilege again to have you join us. And I always learn from your insight, and I'm motivated by your passion. So thanks very much.
Well, hey, thanks, George. I know we're out of time, but something to leave, final thought, something to think about. So I just dropped a link in. Paul Stacey, who you know, is leading a really interesting project right now at Creative Commons. And he's calling it Made with Creative Commons. The original idea was to explore open business models. So businesses that are using openly licensed stuff, whether it's music or Cards Against Humanity's card game, or Lumen Learning, which all of its resources are OER, David's shop, investigating, how do they have a business? And most of these are for-profit businesses. What are their values? What are they actually selling? How do they have a revenue stream? Was kind of the genesis of the project. We're writing a book around this. This was funded by a Kickstarter campaign. Paul and Sarah Pierce are writing this at CC. But and that's all fabulous in its own right. It's also launched a bigger conversation that we're having at Creative Commons, which is there are kind of three big forces in the world that direct how we think about education and other parts of society. You've got the market, which most of our conversations are pushed around. So everything you and I have been talking about, saving students money, publishers coming in and protecting existing business models, these are all market analyses. And then, of course, there's the state. So we talked about policy and working with government. So the state or governments have roles to play. And if you're in an education, at an education institution, the state sometimes is the institution itself and the rules that are imposed there. And then, of course, there's the commons as kind of the third sphere. And the commons in today's world has really been squashed down to this small sphere of influence. But one of the things we're talking about at Creative Commons is, what if that wasn't the case? What if commons values, what if sharing was as important as making a profit? What if instead of maximizing income, the goal was to make enough money to survive and pay people and have a good living, but you didn't need to make more money beyond that, and so you don't charge people more than that. What if we shifted to a different set of values? And then what would the relationship be between the market, the state, and the commons? And these three forces, and Paul's going to talk about this a lot in the book, have shifted over time, right? The commons used to be the biggest sphere, and the market was almost non-existent. The state was relatively small. We move into feudal times, especially in the UK or in that area of the world, and the state got really big, and the market got a little bit bigger, and the commons shrunk as the state started to take over fields and people's livelihoods and things that used to be shared in the commons. And in today's world, the market is kind of the biggest thing. The state is much smaller and is getting pushed smaller all the time. And the commons is something that people don't even know about, to be honest. And so I think everything we talked about is important, and we should fight these fights and have this discussion, but we're almost having it in one or two frames only. And the next time we talk, I'd love to really, let's talk in a commons frame and look at the values that exist or used to exist in the commons, and what kind of conversations can we have there? And how do we push the market in different ways? And how do we push the state in different ways with a different set of values than what those two entities usually entail?
Terrific. Thanks very much again. As I mentioned, great to have you here, and I love your concluding reflections. So good to chat. Great to see you're out there doing the good work.
Have a good night.
All right. Thanks. Take care.